For those of you who I haven't met before, had the opportunity to meet in past webinars, my name is Gail Angolato, and I'm part of the Native Plant Connection team that is putting on this series of webinars. I'd like to remind you that next month's webinar will be on June 21st, also the same time, 12 p.m. Pacific time, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we will be graced with Dr. Orville Baldos from the University of Hawaii, who's going to be talking about planting, design, and establishment of native ornamental landscapes. For those of you who it's your first time joining us for this webinar series, because native plants are so integrally tied to place, I like to start off with a land acknowledgement. Both Jen and I are coming to you today from Corvallis, Oregon, since we're both connected with Oregon State University. And Oregon State University, their longer land acknowledgement notes that we recognize the impact that land grant history has had on Indigenous communities in Oregon. Through the Morrill Act of 1862, which established the land-grant universities in the United States, the federal government seized nearly 11 million acres of land from 250 sovereign tribal nations with little or no compensation. Here in Oregon, in 1868, the state legislature designated Corvallis College as Oregon's land-grant institution. And soon thereafter, Oregon received 90,000 acres of federal lands taken from the Klamath, Coos, Lower Umpqua, Siuslaw, and Coquille people to be sold to create an endowment supporting the growth of the new college, which we now know as Oregon State University. Oregon State University in Corvallis is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River or Amphinepho Band of the Kalapuya. Following the treaty, the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon, and today living descendants of these people are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Indigenous people are valued, contributing members of the Oregon State community and represent multiple sovereign tribes among students, faculty, staff, and alumni. And then I also like to give a little bit of note about native plants which were culturally important to local tribes where the speaker is coming from today. And so today I wanted to talk about camas, which was a staple food crop for the Kalapuya. Its range in Oregon is in Western Oregon. It also goes up into Washington, British Columbia, and down into Northern California, the western parts as well. Camas bulbs were harvested and pressed into cakes and baked. They're highly nutritious and were also used as barter items with tribes. The Kalapuya actively managed open fields to ensure a continuous harvest of camas crops. And I wanted to just give a little bit of story about how Jen and our group look to Indigenous knowledge in relation to Jen's PhD project, where she's looking at pollinator visits to great camas, as well as to camas cultivars, Blue Heaven and Sacagawea, which you can see here on the slide. And unfortunately, not only are camas bulbs incredibly nutritious for humans, but they're also incredibly delicious to the camas pocket gopher. So during 1 year of Jen's study, I believe it was the second year, bulbs just started disappearing from the plots. And when Jen started to excavate the plots, which you can see there in the left-hand picture, there were no more bulbs to be found. So we went to our extension wildlife specialist, Dana Sanchez, and asked Dana, what should we do? We keep losing these camas bulbs from the plots. And Dana suggested that we actually go into the literature and find out what Indigenous folks did to work with the camas pocket gopher. And in that literature, we discovered that the Kalapuya actually looked at the behavior of the camas pocket gopher to try to find out where the food chambers were located, thus making the harvest of camas bulbs easier rather than having to individually find and dig up camas bulbs, they could dig up a large stash at once. And so you can see here that Jen found the food chamber and was able to recover 66 bulbs. And I just wanted to share one little note about this experience, that when she looked at the number of bulbs that were predated by the pocket gophers, we can see that one of the native cultivars was extremely well preferred by the pocket gophers. The other one, the blue heaven, was not, and that the native species was somewhat intermediate between the two. So kind of an unplanned experiment, if you will, related to the preference for native fauna for these different cultivars and the true native. So with that introduction, I do want to introduce Jen, who's going to be talking about native plants for pollinators and what we know about native cultivars. Jen's a graduate student pursuing a PhD in horticulture and entomology. She fell in love with native bees as an undergraduate in the Ricketts Lab at the University of Vermont. Since her first exposure to bee research, she's had the opportunity to work on pollinator studies in Vermont, Ecuador, North Dakota, and Oregon. She's exploring how human-developed landscapes, such as farms and gardens, can achieve the dual goals of pollinator conservation and plant productivity. And with that, Jen, it's my pleasure to hand it over to you.
So again, my name is Jen, and I am here to talk about native plants and native cultivars. And I wanted to start with the key takeaways from the talk, which is represented in this slide. In general, when selecting native plants for pollinators, we recommend choosing native or near native types. So here we have an example of a rose, and the native wild rose, which is on the left side of our screen, has not been modified at all. The flower is relatively simple and open, which allows easy access by pollinators to its important floral resources. As we move to the right of the screen, the flowers are more horticulturally developed with modifications of petal number, size, color, and form. And as the number of petals increases, it actually becomes harder and harder for pollinators to access the pollen and nectar that the original plant provided. So the change in color could also influence a pollinator's capacity to recognize this plant as a potential food source. There are a number of other possible differences between the wild rose and this ready for Valentine's Day bouquet rose, which we'll examine in the rest of the talk. So this is the roadmap for the rest of our discussion. I'll begin with a brief introduction, and then we'll talk about different types of pollinators. In part 3, I'll focus on common floral traits that are modified in the ornamental breeding process and identify some concerns related to pollinators. And then in part 4, we'll talk about current research that's been done to compare pollinator visitation and use of native plants and cultivars. So perhaps a better name for the introduction would be, why should native plant growers care about pollinators? And this will be our first point of discussion. So maybe the most important reason that native plant growers should care about pollinators is the fact that consumers care about pollinators. As many of you know, the demand for native plants is extremely high right now, and the current demand is contributed to native plants' purported benefits to wildlife, especially pollinators and birds. At a pop-up native plant sale in Portland last year, buyers were surveyed as to why they chose native plants. And they ranked pollinator plants, so buying native plants to support pollinators, as the most important reason for choosing native plants. Consumer interest in planting native plants for pollinators benefits growers in multiple ways. So first and foremost, they provide a market for native plants. But second, this specific interest in pollinators can be monetized in additional ways. So a study found that consumers were willing to pay up to around $2 more for a plant that had a pollinator-friendly label. And while this might not seem super substantial. An additional $2 per plant makes a huge difference when you're selling thousands of plants. So consumers care about pollinators, but they also want growers to care about pollinators, especially in terms of production practices. Consumers care about your pest management strategies. So a 2015 study that found that consumers were willing to pay up to $2 more for plants grown using bee-friendly production methods, even when compared to traditional pest management practices. So bee-friendly labeling had a higher impact in this study than those labeled as neonicotinoid-free, which contrasts what I'll show you in this next example. So in this study, they found that consumers with positive attitudes towards pollinator conservation, neonicotinoid labeling regulations, and pro-environmental behavior are willing to pay even higher premiums for plants. So almost $10 more for plants labeled as neonicotinoid free, and almost up to $12 more for plants with the Xerces Society's Be Better certified label. These labeling schemes can significantly impact the price that native plant growers receive for plants, especially when marketing towards environmentally concerned consumers. So now that we've examined some of the reasons that you should be thinking about pollinators as a native plant grower, we're going to talk about the actual pollinators that some native plants support. Honeybees and the monarch butterfly are probably the most well-known pollinators. To make sure we're all on the same page, I do want to quickly mention that honeybees are not native to the United States, so the relationship with native plants may be very different than that of native bees. The life histories of honeybees are also highly contrasting to most native bee species. So while honeybees have queens, workers, and drones and live in hives, most native bee species are solitary and nest in the ground. This means that a single female bee is building a nest and foraging for her young. And while honeybees and monarchs are important, limiting our discussion to these species alone would be a disservice to the 20,000 other bee species and the over 17,000 other butterfly species in the world. So this is a really small snapshot of bee diversity, but I wanted to show that bees come in all shapes, sizes, and colors, including the green bee in the center of the screen here. And then on the top right is a comparison of one of the largest bees in the United States, which is a carpenter bee from Arizona in the genus Xylocopa. And then next to it is one of the smallest bees, which are sometimes called fairy bees, and this is the species Perdita minima. And in the background, you can see my pencil to get a better idea of scale here. And although most of the examples in this talk will be related to bees or butterflies, it's important to note that there are many non-bee and butterfly pollinators. So flies and wasps and moths and birds and bats and even some marsupials are pollinators as well, but we had to limit this talk to some extent. And the reason that I'm taking so much time to emphasize the diversity of pollinators is because the diverse pollinators that visit native plants have different needs, and thus there may not be a one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to breeding native plants that are suitable for pollinators. So 50% of all insects are herbivores, which means 50% of insects derive their food and energy sources directly from plants. The vast majority of insect herbivores are specialists, which means that there is a limited number of plant families, genera, or species that they're able to feed from. To put this into context, that means less than 10% of insect herbivores feed from more than 3 families. So very few herbivores are true generalists. Specialization exists on a spectrum, and its classification remains somewhat of a controversial topic due to the difficulty of sorting insects into explicit groups. So our spectrum spans from specialization to generalization. On one end of the spectrum is monophagy, which means insects that feed on only one species. This is extremely rare, and many researchers now think that this category should actually be retired or to be used to describe insects that feed from a single genus or a single botanical family rather than one species. Moving to the right, we have oligophagy, which includes taxa that feed on a narrow range of plant families. In the middle, we have mesophagy, which means intermediate. And then polyphagy is defined as insects that feed from many different plant families. If we were to assign some familiar faces to this spectrum, we might see the monarch butterfly as an example of a narrowly oligophagic species. So at the larval stage, their eggs and larvae will only survive when feeding on milkweed, but at the adult stage, they can source nectar from a diversity of host plants. And then the European honeybee can be our broadly polyphagic species, both at the adult and larval stage. So again, in this presentation, we're going to look at examples primarily from two insect groups. So I wanted to provide a little more information about them and why I chose them as focal species for this talk. So bees are in the superfamily Apoidea, and they represent 7 different families. The adults primarily consume nectar versus the juveniles feed directly from pollen that is provisioned by the mother bees. And then butterflies and moths come from the order Lepidoptera. Similarly, the adults will feed exclusively on nectar or not at all. And then the juveniles are a little more diverse in terms of the different plant parts that they actually consume. So again, adult bees and butterflies are often generalists with the capacity to nectar from a wider range of plants, but their larval stages can be highly specialized. So specialist bees must collect pollen from a narrow suite of plants in order to provide their larvae with nutrition to undergo development. And then specialist butterflies and moths have to lay their eggs directly on their host plants or where their offspring will be able to find their host. The last note about these two insect groups is that 20 to 45% of native US bees are considered pollen specialists, and in Lepidoptera, host specialization is more common than generalization, with estimates of specialization occurring in 29 to 68% of Lepidopteran taxa that feed on woody plants, and 67 to 94% of Lepidopterans that feed on herbaceous plants. So between these two groups, we have the entire spectrum of specialization represented. So from broad generalists to extreme specialists, which makes them an ideal taxa to examine pollinator response to native plant breeding. So now that we've covered pollinator diversity, we're going to talk about the relationship between pollinators and plants. So let's first remind ourselves again what pollinators get from plants. So plants are the primary source of nutrition for insect pollinators, and from them they can forage for nectar, which provides a source of sugar or energy, and from pollen, which is highly nutritious and used to feed developing larvae. So plants might also be a source of nesting resources for some pollinators. So for example, the bee that's on the screen is a leafcutter bee, and they harvest pieces of leaves in order to build their nests. So bees may also use sticks, mud, resin, flower petals, and even snail shells as nesting resources. And plants can also provide refuge for pollinators. So you might see some bees spending the night inside of flowers or waiting on a leaf for a storm to pass. Butterflies often will perch on plants and bask as they warm up before flying for the day. And then some bees actually nest inside of hollow or pithy plant stems as well. And for plants that require animal or insect-mediated pollination, visitation by pollinators is directly related to reproductive output in plants. So it shouldn't be surprising then that plants have complex strategies to communicate with their pollinators. Many of these communication strategies are visible or easily detected by humans, such as strong smelling flowers, bright colors or patterns, or having an abundance of open flowers. Others, however, may be less obvious to us, such as patterns that are only visible under ultraviolet light, or slight differences in floral temperature, or even the micromorphology of a petal surface. Some of these signals may be altered in the plant breeding process. So now I've highlighted 3 traits that are really important to pollinators that are directly and intentionally altered by plant breeders. The rest that are not highlighted are still likely impacted in the plant breeding process, though likely unintentionally. So other desirable ornamental traits that breeders might select for include longer bloom duration, increased bloom size or bloom density, the number of petals, plant habit, so shorter or more compact plants, resistance traits such as drought and disease, and also sterility. Over the next few slides, we're going to look at a few examples of modified petal traits, how they interact with other plant traits, and then also talk about the importance of bloom duration and architectural traits. So here is an example using California poppy. On the top, we have the native, and below are 4 different cultivars, which show quite a breadth of possible floral alterations. So from left to right, we observe changes in color, color in size, color, size, and shape, as well as color, pattern, and petal number. And for this plant, it's pretty clear that novel color is one of the most desired traits, as it seems to occur across all 4 of these examples. I wanted to show another, perhaps more common as well as drastic example of changes in petal number, which comes from roses. So on the top, we have 2 wild species of rose. The left is of European origin, and the other is a Chinese native rose. And both of these species have been bred for double flowers, so increase in petal number, as well as size and color, and they're hardly recognizable as their wild ancestors. When breeding for increased petal number in plants, there are sometimes consequences for the reproductive capacity of that plant. So Camellia japonica provides an example of a sort of spectrum of functional reproductive organs when it comes to increasing petal number, and the outcomes can be highly variable. So on the left, we have the wild type, which is a very classic open flower with all of its reproductive parts in the center. In the center of the screen is the anemone form, which has more petals, petaloid stamen, as well as completely degenerated stamen and pistils. And then on the right is a formal double, which has way more petals. It no longer has any reproductive organs. So Camellia japonica is not highly visited by most pollinators, but if it were, the formal double would not have any pollen or nectar to provide to insect visitors. Another example of interactions between petal and reproductive traits from selection for petal color in Great Camas. So if you get up close to these plants, you'll notice that in addition to differences in their petal colors, they have different colored male organs. So from the filament to the anther to the actual expression of pollen color. So in some plants, petal traits cannot be modified without altering the expression of other floral organs as well. So even bloom duration is something we should consider for pollinators. So here we have Douglas aster and 2 cultivars, both of which were selected from wild Douglas aster populations. And though their flowers are not significantly different in terms of their morphology, the duration of their bloom is variable across the 3 plant types. So if you're a pollinator looking for for forage in the height of the summer, that might not make a huge difference. If you're a bumblebee, however, and you have 2 seasons where workers or queens are highly abundant, the availability of floral resources becomes more important. So in this case, the 2 cultivars would not be available for newly emerged bumblebee queens looking for forage at the end of the bloom season. And what we've found in the literature is that the 2 seasons where forage is lacking for pollinators is in the early spring and the end of the summer. So native plants that bloom through the end of the summer are really important for those late flying pollinators. So plants have evolved multiple strategies to limit competition for pollinators and adapt to their environment. Floral architecture is a really great example of one of these strategies. So heliconia provides more an example of extreme coevolution between plant architecture and pollination strategy. It's a tropical plant, and the yellow parts that are inside of those large red bracts are the actual flowers of the plant. Betts et al. Looked at hummingbirds with different beak lengths and shapes, and one butterfly for their capacity to remove nectar for heliconia flowers. And so according to this graph, lower values on the y-axis means that there was a greater success at nectar extraction. So on the left, we have the highest rate of nectar extraction, and then on the right with the butterfly is the lowest rate of nectar extraction. They found that this one species of hummingbird was the best at removing nectar from the plants, and it was largely related to its beak shape. So the beak fits well into the heliconia flower, and they actually fly upside down to drink the nectar from it. So it's a really specialized relationship. Not only was this species the best adapted for drinking nectar from the plant, it was also the best pollinator of the plant. So as it flies longer distances, it can visit more spatially separated populations of the plant and then bring in a greater genetic diversity of pollen transported from plant to plant. To bring in an architectural example from North America, we can look at columbine. So plants that have flowers that hang downwards may actually attract more low-flying pollinators over high-flying ones, and the actual architecture of that flower may be designed for a specific type of pollinator, like we saw with the heliconia. So Western red columbine is a pretty tall plant with hanging flowers, but many of the cultivars have been modified to be either really low growing or have upright inflorescences, which could completely change the suite of pollinators that actually visit that plant. So now we're going to move into current research that's been done examining native plants and native cultivars. But before we dive in to some explicit examples of pollinator use of native plants and cultivars, I want to provide you with some key takeaways from 5 studies that examined pollinator use of these 2 plant types. So in her study of Vermont native plants and cultivars, Dr. White found that pollinators prefer to forage on native species over cultivated varieties of the native species, but not in all cases and not exclusively. In their study of shrubs, Ricker et al. Found that native shrub cultivars are not universally less or more attractive to pollinators and must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. When examining herbivore use of trees and shrubs, Beisden et al. Concluded that the usefulness of native cultivars in restoring insect-driven food webs depends on the cultivar trait that has been selected. When examining natives and cultivars in Maine, Dibble et al. Found a preference for the native in only 2 out of 6 pairs of plant species and only for a handful of pollinator groups. And then Baker et al., who examined monarch use and bee visitation to 6 types of milkweed, found that cultivars can be as suitable as their parental species for supporting monarch butterflies and native bees. So these 5 studies either have conflicting results or state that plants need to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Since our time is limited today, I can't show you every example of a native cultivar plant pair that did or did not have different usage by pollinators, but instead I want to highlight a few cases where we did see a difference in pollinator use, because those are the cases we want to be informed by when thinking about the development of native cultivars. So, although we're primarily going to talk about floral traits for the rest of this talk, I wanted to sneak in one well-studied example of foliage color here. This will also be our only non-pollinator example, but has implications for pollinators. So a study examining egg-laying rates and feeding by a specialist beetle on common ninebark found significantly lower use of the cultivar Monlo compared to the native ninebark and the cultivar Darts Gold. They didn't find any difference between the native and Darts Gold, however. They hypothesized that the reason Monlo was used less was because of its foliage color, which has a high anthocyanin content. So anthocyanins are the pigments responsible for purple and red coloration in plants and are known to act as feeding deterrents. So this species, or the genus Physocarpus, are known hosts of butterflies and moths, so it's possible that foliage with a high composition of anthocyanins could deter them as well. In a study that did look at pollinator visitation on the native and Monlo, they found no difference in pollinator visitation, interestingly, except by syrphid flies, which visited Monlo at a higher rate. So they hypothesized that the contrast between the flowers and the foliage could have drawn more flies to the plant. This next example is of chokeberry. So they found that these three chokeberries were very similar in the overall bee communities that they attracted. These plants varied in their floral density, so the number of flowers on each plant, in addition to their size. So the wild type is fairly tall and spreading. Groundhog is a low growing spreader, and then lowscape mound is low growing and doesn't spread quite as much as the other two types. When examining the bee communities that visited these plants, Ricker et al. Noticed that the only difference was when they examined bees at the family level. So Andrenidae, the mining bee family, is a family that has a high percentage of specialized bee species. Ricker et al. Found that the native chokeberry attracted significantly more andrenids than the two cultivars, which was likely due to the larger size of the native and its total number of flowers. A second shrub from their study was Dasyphora fruticosa, or shrubby cinquefoil, and two cultivars with differences in flower color, ploidy, and floral shape. Pink Beauty clearly has a different flower color than the wild type, and Goldfinger is a suspected tetraploid with wider flowers. In their study, they found that the native received more visitation by bumblebees and leafcutter bees, and they suggest that is due to the color shift in Pink Beauty and either the size of the petals or unapparent changes to floral rewards in Goldfinger. I did want to mention that they documented a unique example of non-trophic herbivory by bees. So as we've mentioned before, leafcutter bees cut pieces of leaves to use to divide the chambers in their nests. Some leafcutters are actually petal cutters, so they harvest little crescent shapes from petals to use instead of leaves. And Ricker et al. Noted that the leafcutters did harvest from the petals of the native and Goldfinger, but not of Pink Beauty. So it's interesting that Goldfinger was not necessarily a preferred source of forage, but it still made an acceptable choice for a nest resource. This next example comes from my own research. One of our study plants is Farewell to Spring, which is Clarkia amoena. We examined pollinator visitation to the native Clarkia amoena subspecies Lindleyi and three cultivars, Aurora, Dwarf White, and Scarlet. And the cultivars varied in terms of their flower color, size, and habit. So we found significantly different visitation by pollinators to these 4 plant types. The bar graph here shows that when looking at visitation of all pollinators, they significantly preferred the native compared to the cultivars. And we found this trend to be true when we looked at all bees, so removing butterflies and flies from our analysis. Wild bees, so removing the managed Apis mellifera, the western honeybee. When we looked at just bumblebees, when we looked at just longhorned bees, but interestingly, we didn't detect a difference in mean visitation to the Clarkia types by leafcutter bees. We did notice, however, that leafcutter bees harvested Clarkia amoena petals for their nests, and so a student in our lab decided to survey each of the plants for leafcutter bee usage. So when we looked at the number of flowers with this characteristic crescent cut shape, we found that the native Clarkia had significantly greater usage by leafcutter bees compared to its cultivars. So this is kind of similar to the case with the Dasyphora fruticosa from Ricker et al., because although we didn't see any difference in leafcutter visitation to these plants, there's a notable difference in usage of the plants for nesting resources. We touched only briefly on pollen color in the previous section, but I wanted to further highlight its importance. This example doesn't come from a native cultivar study, but provides an example of pollen color preference that occurs in pollinators. So this flower here is Campanula americana, which is a flower that has a natural variation in its pollen colors, spanning from white to pinkish to dark purple. And on the right is a leafcutter bee, Megachile campanulae, which specializes on this flower. In a study that compared pollinator visitation to campanula flowers with different colored pollen, here they only looked at white and purple, they found that the specialist pollinator drove a strong and consistent preference for the purple pollen, which is represented by the 3 asterisks above the Megachile group in this figure. The preference in this group was statistically significant, whereas bumblebees and small bees did not have a clear preference for either pollen color. The authors hypothesized that this color preference was not necessarily due to the color itself, but rather the nutritional value of the pollen. So the purple pollen had a much higher anthocyanin rate, coming again with our pigments, which is responsible for the purple pigmentation. And it also had larger pollen grains than the white pollen. They hypothesized that this might provide a better nutrient ratio in the pollen, or perhaps signify a higher protein content compared to the white pollen. They also noted that the purple pollen has a higher heat tolerance and could possibly have a stronger scent profile, which could also help to explain this color preference. And since we examined pollen, I want to talk about nectar as well, since it's the other primary food source for adult bees and butterflies and moths. This figure also comes from Dr. Annie White's work and looks at the nectar volume produced by lobelia flowers. Lobelia X speciosa is a hybrid designation for plants developed from Lobelia fulgens, Lobelia cardinalis, and Lobelia syphilitica. All 3 of those species are native to the eastern United States, though only the nectar volumes of the straight species Lobelia cardinalis and Lobelia syphilitica appear here, in addition to 2 cultivars. So it's very apparent from this figure that there's a great difference in the mean nectar volume provided by these 4 flowers, and that can have great impacts on their attractiveness to adult pollinators, since they are dependent on nectar for providing a high energy food source. This change in nectar production in fan scarlet compared to the red Lobelia cardinalis may or may not be impactful to all of the pollinators that typically visit Lobelia cardinalis. What we know, however, is that hummingbirds often visit red tubular flowers, whereas bees tend to visit blue, white, purple, and yellow flowers. There are, of course, exceptions to every rule, but these are known trends. So if you're a hummingbird that typically gets its primary source of nectar from Lobelia cardinalis, if you come across a fan scarlet plant, you'll have to visit significantly more flowers to obtain the same amount of nectar. Bees, which don't burn quite the same amount of energy as their bird companions, are likely less impacted by this change in nectar quantity. In her thesis, Dr. White also compared 4 types of Echinacea purpurea, which represented a spectrum of floral trait modifications within a single species. So on the left is the native Echinacea, then we have white swan, which has white petals, then pink double delight, which is a double flowered cultivar, and then sunrise, which has yellow petals, and it's an interspecific hybrid that is also sterile. Across 3 pollinator groups, bumblebees, native bees, and butterflies and moths, the native plant attracted more pollinators than the other 3 types. So though for other native bees and the Lepidoptera group, the white swan was a close second. This final example combines ornamental changes, so flower, color, stature, etc., and considers a trait important to pollinators that is less apparent compared to things like color and bloom size. So this case comes from a study examining monarch visitation and utilization of 2 milkweed species and their cultivars. So in this figure here, in the left column, we have Asclepias incarnata. The wild type is that first image, and then B, C, and D are 3 cultivars of Asclepias incarnata. And then in the right column, we have the wild type Asclepias tuberosa on top, and then F, G, and H are cultivars of that species. In this study, they analyzed the defensive characteristics of the plants, including the amount of latex exuded, trichome density, and cardenolide levels. So trichomes are a physical defense. They're those tiny little plant hairs that we see. Latex is used by plants in different ways to either harm herbivores or to heal plant wounds. And then cardenolides are a steroid, which is toxic to many insect herbivores, though some have evolved target site insensitivity, which limits the effects of those toxins. And that is the case that we see with the monarch butterfly and its host plant milkweed. For both of the milkweed species groups, there was some amount of variation in each of the 3 defensive characteristics, with only a few statistically significant differences. Despite this variation, however, there was no significant difference in the number of eggs and larvae found on the milkweeds in the gardens, nor in monarch larval performance on plants in the greenhouse. Larval performance was only monitored for 7 days, which may overestimate the true success of these plants as larval hosts, but even a short trial is noteworthy for having the capacity to support a well-known specialist butterfly. Right, so wrapping things up. From all the cases we've examined, we've learned that it's hard to generalize across plant species and plant traits and how they may or may not impact pollinators. So if we can't make generalizations, then the choice that makes the most sense is to base plant selections off of the taxa who will be most sensitive or susceptible to change. So supporting specialist pollinators will also aid in the maintenance of diversity of other pollinators, because generalists will likely be able to find a suitable host within a suite of plants selected for specialists. We ultimately recommend selecting native plants that are close to the wild type as possible if our goal is to maintain ecological benefits of native plants to pollinators. And I think a quote that summarizes this really well says, during ornamental trait development in native plant species, the trait and the source material should be chosen to maintain ecological and adaptive functions. I want to just quickly acknowledge my lab. Our research is supported by Sherry Shang and Spike Wadsworth, as well as grants from the Oregon Department of Agriculture, the Native Plant Society of Oregon, and the Garden Club of America. I also want to thank all of you that were able to attend today. This is my contact information and the link to the Garden Ecology Lab blog if you have any questions or want to stay updated on our work.